Hi, this is Miliastra Mechanic, or Damien here. First, I want to thank you for your warm welcome and support of my gunplay tutorial. Despite its length, I genuinely appreciate anyone who checked it out, and I will try to be a bit more concise going forward, while still delivering as much helpful information as possible. With that out of the way, today I want to talk about scene generation. It's a great feature that's not noticed by many in the Luna 4 update. I really wanted to cover it as I am positive that I have experienced the most with it in the Creative Front community, probably a lot. Just asking the Discord about my Infinite Castle, paper scroll based RPG text system, meat letters, city block size, city block based Rubik's Cubes, and more. Scene generation may seem limited at first, and it definitely is to a degree, but it has a lot more uses than you may think. Not just rapid area expansion, but knowing the actual mechanics, how it generates a scene. You can actually come up with some pretty cool use cases, which I will cover later. Thank you. All right, let's continue. First, let's briefly cover what scene generation is and what it's meant to solve. Have you ever wanted to create a lush forest but found placing every single piece of vegetation, trees, rocks, and more was too frustrating? Or maybe you were making a prototype and wanted a nice area to test your gameplay in without taking the time to lovingly place every sprig of grass, all while having extreme minute control over each aspect of the generation within a simple interface. That's exactly what scene generation is for. It's a system where you define a template for generating objects in the scene and place it in the world. There's definitely some limitations, and to burst your bubble early, there's no way to execute a template and generate a scene during game runtime. There are sadly no nodes for it, which is unfortunate, but it is still extremely useful. Let's open up the scene generation to begin with before I briefly go over the concepts of the UI. So we go to the main menu, scroll down, and scene generation template management. This is a panel that will hold all your templates you create. Let's go ahead and start a new one and take a tour around before we start customizing. The first thing you'll notice is this giant bounding box. This is the area inside which your scene will generate. You can also turn this box into a giant cylinder should you wish. And you can see some of the buttons at the bottom as well. Just for fun, let's hit random preview. It will run the default rules that Hoyo has provided us. Every time you hit it, you can see the scene generation changes. On the right-hand side, or where the main controls are, you can see how the bounding cuboid our objects will spawn in is defined here. And of course, we can adjust it with the gizmos as usual. Or I'm putting the numbers here manually. So now you can see it'll generate a bit larger. And at the top, you'll see a drop-down box as well. This is where we can save a custom generation that we really like as we're going through finding potential choices. So if I really like this one, I could save it, and I could check for more. And I could go back to this one. And then this is the pretty much everything you need to know about this part of the tab. Let's move on to asset configuration now. The next tab may be a bit overwhelming, but trust me, it will all make sense really shortly. It's very intuitive once you know how the system generates the layout of the scene. First, I'm going to collapse all these tabs to hide the mess and explain how the system places each object with a demo scene. And then I will show you how each option changes that generation. So as you can see with the layers descending, we have a rock layer, a building layer, a tree layer, vegetation, and decoration layer. And you'll also see that represented in our scene here. So you have these beautiful rocks, a couple of buildings, some sparse, colorful trees, some nice vegetation near them, and some decoration here with the stumps. Essentially, whenever you generate a preview of your rules, in this case the default ones, the system is going down layer by layer, placing each thing according to each layer's unique rules until it reaches the end. You can actually see this happening in real time whenever you hit random preview. Feel free to try that out. It's important to note now that while each layer has their own generation rules, they do not lock what models you can put in there, which gives you a lot of freedom in how you generate a scene. The order the scene generates is as such. It goes in the order in the layer list: rock, buildings, trees, vegetation, and finally decoration layers, along with whatever custom layers you create. Each layer has its own unique properties in a way, so we will cover each one of those going down the order of generation now. In doing so visually, we will understand what each setting on the menu does. Starting with the rock layer, this is a mix of my assumption based on documentation, testing, and knowledge of how other games do it. Based on the generation density, the game places a bunch of points inside the bounding box. The higher the value of generation density, the more objects, and of course the opposite as well. There's a chance that this is low enough that nothing will spawn. The randomization helps determine the noise of the placement of these initial points, and rocks are basically the anchor of the entire system. If nothing is generated on this layer, then all other layers are skipped. So for example, with this template here, we have an option called Generate Based on Terrain, which will place the points glued to the ground so that objects aren't just floating in the ether. It helps ground them to the scene. And as you can see out here, it will spawn here, but it won't spawn all the way out here. Now, if you lift the box up a little bit so it no longer contacts the ground, and you spawn, suddenly nothing spawns in at all of any of the layers. This is because, as I said earlier, all the following layers are anchored to the rock layer, but also nothing can spawn because it isn't finding ground. So if you disable this, suddenly you have floating generation. Another important thing to note is rock layer is the only layer whose objects can spawn inside of each other, in case you want to create a large rocky terrain. All the following layers in the order fail to place objects if they would place them inside a previous layer's object to keep the scene realistic, so you don't have like houses inside of houses. So once these points are generated, the system then goes through the asset list here and randomly chooses a model from it. And the higher the weight, the higher the chance it's picked. And then it places the scene based on those points. If you added multiple objects to this layer, say larger and smaller rocks, so let's quickly add another rock. Let's add this one. And you then increase the weight of this one by like, set it to 5, and this one to like 2. And then you generate it. Let's increase the density so the rocks are more obvious. You will notice that these rocks are way more common than these rocks around the entire build. And if we instead flipped it like, set this to 10 and this to 1, we will see almost none of these like more vertical rocks. You see it's mostly the larger chunky rocks. So you can see how weight affects the generation. Let's head into the details of the rock layer. We will step through each process of the layer generation. There are 2 important menus here. The Assets menu, where all the assets of a layer are visible, and the Settings menu, where you can change each potential asset's spawning rules. For example, we'll add a second rock. The layer, and if we change an option on 1, so let's say we make this a maximum, so it stays the maximum size at all times, and you toggle between them, you see each different asset has unique spawning rules. So to my best assumption, whenever the system places those initial points, it then goes through this transformation range and applies the random offsets, rotations, and zooms. And if the point is still valid, then it places the objects, as you can see with our rocks in the scene. For a visual example, if you want to give X a potential max offset of 3, you can imagine the center gizmo here as the initial state of the points that are generated, and the 2 faint ones on either side as the possible points the offset can move in the X-axis. So an offset is just how far in whatever axis an object can spawn based on the initial point. So if the initial point was at 0, 0, 0, and the maximum X offset was 3, then that means the rock can be placed somewhere between X0 to X minus 3, or from X0 to X3. Pretend my beautiful drawing is accurate to 3D space, please. So it's the initial point plus the random number between the offset for each axis. You have to set a maximum offset to set a minimum one, by the way. This actually trips a lot of people up. The same for rotation. It's called jitter. You can sadly only jitter around the y-axis. So spinning it on a turntable, basically, which is nice, of course, but it sucks for those trying to build cool rotating objects in the air in all sorts of directions. But it is good to know. And, of course, scale randomization with zoom to add even more variety to your scenes. And just with these settings per asset on a layer, we can add so much variety to a scene. Besides a couple of other important unique rules for some other layers, that's really a majority of the settings explained. Before I move on to explain those last few bits, I do want to suggest a tip that has saved me a ton of time. Due to how frustrating it is whenever you are adding a new asset, let's say you scroll down and do this, and then you want to go back up here, you are going to lose your place in this model list, even if you wanted to select from the same layer again. So what I would actually suggest is going down here and going to the Asset Entity Placement tab and lay out each layer's objects ahead of time. And then you can use the Select from Scene button and you can just add them quickly to each layer. This will help save you a ton of time, trust me. So in order to show you how each layer generates, this is going to be the example terrain, and we've already talked about the rocks, and you will see those over here. So as you can see, the points have been placed, and then it randomized those based off the offsets and scaled and or rotated. And now we will move on to the next layer in the list, which is the building layer. As you can see, the building layer has generated. And as it is not a rock, it will always try to keep the object outside another previous layer's objects. I want to show a quick example of one important option that all non-rock layers have, which is the generate interval distance option. Essentially, it increases the force field around the assets of the layer to set on. This prevents all later layer objects from placing points within this distance, similar to how the normal object occlusion works, but you can increase it here. So in this example, we have maxed out tree density, but we would like to carve away all the objects in the vicinity of these houses to keep it clear. So watch as we increase the general interval distance to the maximum, and check out the big difference in the generation. As you can see, everywhere the houses spawn, there's a gigantic radius that carves out the previous trees. It's just one of many options and tools in the trade that cascades down all of the layers and causing massive differences in generation that you should really take note of. Sadly, the only other difference here is that despite having the other rotation axes available here, unless I am mistaken, and it is an oversight by Hoyo, you can still only rotate around the y-axis, which is really tragic. Now to the layer with the most important unique rule, the tree layer. The reason this layer is so important is due to the layer below it. Remember how nothing can generate without a rock layer asset? This is a more local rule like that. The vegetation layer cannot generate without a tree layer asset to generate around. That's one of the other very important rules. Other than that, this layer is similar to all other non-rock layers. The next layer has some cool use cases due to this unique interaction, which we will explore a lot more heavily near the end of the video. As explained before, the vegetation layer is linked uniquely to the tree layer. Without a tree layer, the vegetation layer will not start generating. However, there is another unique secret. It will only generate in the associated range around a tree defined here. As with most Miliastra limitations, we can actually use this to create the unique effect I'll talk about later. But essentially, this sets the range around which a tree it will generate, and it will not go any further than that. There isn't really anything unique to say about the decoration layer, but this is a great time to remind you that each of these layers, to my understanding, spawns clusters of those unique points we talked about earlier, based on the generation density inside the box, following the rule set. And as you recall, only the rock layer can spawn inside other objects. Unless you abuse the generation density, models will almost never overlap, which means by the time we reach the decoration layer, or any custom layers below it, there's a great chance that if the generation density is low enough, we will never see a decoration layer asset due to there already being so many objects in the scene. It can struggle to find a clean place to generate. Just something to keep in mind. Finally, you have custom layers, which are basically a bare bones layer for adding more assets to generate at the end of the process here. So that was a lot to take in, but it essentially breaks down like this. For each layer, the system places a bunch of points, then it adds the random offset / rotations you set up, and if that spot it places in is valid, then the object is generated there. The rock layer is the only one that can naturally spawn objects inside of each other. All following layers exclude spawning in the place of items placed by previous layers, and vegetation can only spawn if trees are spawned. And the spawn order is rocks, then buildings, then trees, then vegetation, then decorations, and then the custom layers. Alright, now that we have covered the feature set, it's time to put that knowledge to work. I first want to show a quick method to carve out a nice shape and story into these generated scenes. Then we will generate a completed map from scratch. And as a bonus at the end, I will show you some fun ways I've abused the limitations of this feature. First off, let me show you some cool tips of mine for how you can carve the shape to attain a final desired effect. Let's say, for example, we generated this scene, which is a default template, and we actually want to make a nice clear trail through the center of the tree line here, like a woodland drive or a tree tunnel. In this case, let's get the angle we want to start carving. And just like Bob Ross with a palette knife, we're going to scrape away the parts we don't want from our canvas. Let's drag here. So we're getting that tree a bit, and I don't want that. Yeah, that's right. You see, just by hitting the delete key, we can carve a clear tunnel straight through the middle here. now that we can use pathway asset here if we wanted to, or maybe add a little more density here for the trees and then carve it away. So we have a really genuine tree tonal effect here for a pathway for your story game, just with a single selection drag. This is actually way more helpful than you think. I'll show you more use cases in a bit for this. But this is really good to keep in mind because you can carve out the general shape of an area that you want. You don't just have to stay within the bounds of the box. Okay, I think today we'll create a nice ice glacier terrain. It'll have a frigid river running through it, separating both sides for a cool PvP map. We'll do this by using the scene generation and some pretty smart asset management. Let's briefly go through the assets and add them, and they are lined up in generation order as I suggested. There are, sadly, not many rock variant assets in Miliastra, especially ice ones, so we have a limited selection. We will do with it as we can. And we will do the select from scene as described earlier. I threw in the gray boulder for variation, as well as to break up the white scenery and to fill gaps. For the buildings, I felt like a Fatui camp out in a frozen wasteland just made sense, as well as some of the desolate building pieces from ages past, perhaps full of lore and goodies that have been long forgotten. So we will add all of those. Oh, sorry. Let's delete that accidental one. For the trees, realistically, there should be mostly dead trees, but the dead tree options are minimum, as in like one actual tree. And also, I feel like adding some pops of color with these cold-looking trees actually works really well when they are so sparse. And the leaves look like they are dying on the browner trees, which felt apt for a tree barely hanging on. Some colored vegetation as well. I feel like it has kind of a cold tone to it, just to, again, add some color to the map. And finally, the decorations. I felt like the snowmen were like kind of cute. Maybe the board Fatui created them, and the snow piles are also nice. These piles stand out a bit too much, so we will keep them as a bare minimum in the decorations, but I thought these were some nice things to add to the map. This is supposed to be like a glacier-esque zone where the melt is running off, creating a river. So the entire ground would be covered in these glacier rocks, kind of like if glaciers crashed together and kind of folded under the pressure. So this initial layer will be a high density. Let's set it to like 4. We got to keep performance in mind, but this will be the largest mass. So let's set the gray rocks, which are supposed to be accents on the scene, to be like a 0.1 weight. Everything else except the tiniest white rock should be a 1. Let's set these to like 0.3. This way the larger ones have a higher chance of spawning and filling in the gaps, making sure there are no gaps in the floor showing the terrain below. And it will also use less rocks for performance reasons. We also want less gray rocks under the surface where they're useless because they're supposed to jet out. So let's set the maximum Y offset to 1 and the minimum to 0.5. So they actually jut out of the white rocks. For the large white rocks, let's give them a minimum size of 1.25. And this will help them, like I said earlier, fill in the gaps. And for the tiniest one, we will make them as large as possible. So the minimum is 1.50. And when it's spawned, it'll give a nice texture and depth to the area. We want these buildings to be extremely sparse. It's a tiny Fatui camp in like a glacier wasteland. So it'll have a large central tent and maybe some of the offshoot tents. So let's set the density first to 0.25. We want the normal tent to be the most common at 0.6. And the biggest central tent should be the rarest at 0.1 because there only really needs to be one central tent. The wooden piles can be a little bit more common, maybe 0.3. And the house should also be really rare because it just stands out so much as a structure that it will be easily noticeable when copy-pasted. The only other setting I really want to change is on the tent. I want to change the minimum zoom to 1. That way we have a large tent every time. Next up is the trees. Let's set their density to 0.75 because we don't want too many of them because it's a winter wasteland. But it will still add some interesting texture to the scene and potential cover. Let's work through this and try generating some random previews. Get an idea of how the trees are looking. I think the colorful trees are a bit too common. They should be standouts. So let's try 0.1 for those. And let's see how that looks. Yeah, you can see they're generating a lot more sparsely. Actually, a bit too sparsely. Let's try 0.2. Yeah, see, this is what we want. We want them to be kind of like centerpieces of the scene that just distinguish the large white landmass. For the dead trees, I think it should be this one the most common at 0.6, and the dying trees should be a tiny bit sparser because they should be barely hanging on. And let's check that out. I actually think we could drop the colorful trees just by 0.1. Yeah, I like that a lot. Has a nice density of them to break up the map a bit, but it's not too much. You can still tweak this a lot, obviously, to whatever you prefer. I'm actually pretty happy with how the vegetation is looking. They're sparse enough. There's no particular vegetation that stands out to me, and it adds a tiny bit of color to break the map up. They might be a tiny bit smaller, but it's fine. Here is a fun way to visualize associated range, though. Let's drag the density of the vegetation layer up to 10, and let's set the range to like 5, and you'll notice how they spawn around the trees. You see them clustering around the trees here. That gives you a good idea of how the associated range works with the vegetation linked to the tree layer. If you wanted to, you could break it up with the randomization more. Also, just to be clear, we should set these back after we do those examples, like with the trees as well. And for the decoration layer, let's set all the snowmen to 0.1. They should be very rare, as the Fatui are busy people, supposedly. And that's honestly about it. You're free to mess around with these values more, especially to learn how they affect the scene. It's actually really useful to do, as you don't realize how much one choice can cascade down the map, for example. If we increase the chance of a big Fatui tent and increase its interval distance to 10, meaning future layer objects can't spawn in a large distance from it, you will see the map become way sparser for later layers, as I showed earlier. The things cascade quickly down the stack, so just knowing how the generation happens helps inform you what to change for the effects you want, but it's also just a vibes game. Let's find the one we prefer and show you the final few important bits of the UI before adding the river. If you'd like a random preview, don't forget what I showed you earlier about saving the distribution rules, and then we can basically save favorites and go back later to find the best one. All right, let's go through a few until it has the main assets we want, which is a nice distribution of trees and vegetation to break up the white of the ice. And it needs at least one main Fatui tent, and we're going to cut a river through the middle, so we don't want anything important in the center. This one's kind of nice, but it lacks the colorful trees. Ooh, this is a really nice one. I like this one. It has the main Fatui tent. It kind of splits up the sides. There are tents on this side, an abandoned building, a tree over here and here. This would be a great point to cut through the river. So let's move on to that. All right, now that we have the right distribution, let's continue placement. On the base attribute side, you'll see a button called Place Scene. I've already hit it. We'll just have to hit Confirm Generation. And now that we have this, let's start carving some space for the river. Let's just move the box out of the way. And kind of as I described earlier, let's just start cutting away in a kind of generally river-shaped mass. All right. I think that is good. Now it's time to create the river part. So let's head to the asset menu and head to the landform category under static units. And here let's search for a waterfall. And I'll show you a pretty nice method of faking running water in an area. First, let's turn it on its side. And let's make it super long to draw out the river. As you can see, it kind of looks like a running river. And we can make it wider if we need to. And let's kind of slide it into place and get it positioned. Alright. See how nice that looks? Now, of course, gameplay-wise, you're going to want to add like a kill box below here or something, since people can't actually swim in it. But it's still nice to have visually. I feel like it really adds a nice bit to the map. The snowman probably needs to go. But the only downside is, since it has this long gradient, you're going to want to add a maybe like a cliffside here to hide this bit here. And maybe over here you can add another cliffside with an actual waterfall coming down that's feeding this, maybe glacier water. Then that will conveniently flow out of the map underneath those rocks. If you want to see a quick solve for that, and let's be extra and click to create a new scene generation template, let's generally size it to this area and put it a bit above it. And let's disable all layers except rocks. And then let's go into the assets and let's select from our scene down here. Let's set the gray rock to a minimum of 0.1, and let's also disable generate based on terrain. Let's also maximize the size these will spawn as to maximize the space covered. Sorry for the skip ahead. I thought I recorded, but I apparently did not. I essentially just set the generation density to 5, the randomization to 0.10, and as you can see the bounding box here. And in here, I set the minimum Y to 2 and the maximum to 10 for the white rocks. That way they would go high up, but also at least guarantee spawn a minimum of 2Y. And also maximize their zoom so they're large as possible to fill as much space as possible. And this one as well so that it spawns high up, but obviously the weight is lower, so you'll see these less. You could theoretically keep raising this box up and make it higher and higher, generating more and more, and then use the selection trick to start carving off bits for shape and efficiency, but you get the general concept. We've hidden the gradient behind that, and the water kind of flows out of the map. And over here you could do something similar, but have a waterfall come down to feed the river. I promise to show you some fun examples of how you can abuse these tools and make some fun things. Maybe not things that should ever be seen or used by anyone, but I think showing how we can use these limitations to our advantage is important for scene dressing, not just map generation. But even if this scene dressing is mostly absurd, that I will show you in a moment. Alright, let's say in your game you have a war-ravaged paper squirrel local legend who is surrounded by the weapons of their fallen foes that they've defeated. If you wanted, you can manually place tons of weapons by hand, or you could use scene generation to generate the squirrel as a tree and use the vegetation layer for the swords so they spawn surrounding the squirrel. Maybe you then wanted the squirrel to have a throne, so we can use the carving tip to carve away some of the weapons. Or what if the squirrel was a king from an unnamed series that definitely had a great ending, and we place the swords behind his throne and we stretch some of them with the scale/zoom tool? Or what if you wanted to make a solid cylinder of waterfalls with occasional bush on top that definitely doesn't crash your game and take 5 minutes to generate? How about using the rock layers with buildings set to a high generation density, making them spawn inside of each other, and then continuously raising the y-axis and slowly tapering it as it gets higher and higher, creating a giant infinite castle, which you then promptly get stuck inside of? Or how about a city block sized Rubik's Cube where every incorrect turn costs thousands of lives? If you are more into novels, then how about creating a giant block of squirrels and carving out an entire alphabet from them to create an RPG text system made entirely out of said paper squirrels? If you don't like squirrels, you could instead use masses of meat and carve words out of it instead. And you can't forget the giant block of lanterns that is definitely necessary and totally not laggy at all. And just to be clear, 99% of this is a terrible idea. It was mostly just having fun learning the system. The performance hit is absurd. There's no realistic use case for any of this, but it is cool to know. I really hope that you learned something cool here or useful. I know there are a lot of limitations in this system. Trust me, I know that. So I wanted to post my findings as of Luna 4 here. It's important to note, while verticality does seem limited due to the offset limitations, horizontally you can go absolutely insane generating massive areas. And here are my findings for the limitations, the values for each individual possible box. And with that, I want to thank you for watching and supporting. I know I'm not great at this yet, but I really am trying my best, so I appreciate any and all support. I will try my best to make shorter content in the future. At least this one was under an hour. Thank you.